And now we're going to talk a little bit about the expanded resume at UT Austin. This is one of my favorites. The first thing to note is that while we refer to it as a resume, and so do they, it actually doesn't look as much like a traditional resume as you might think, mainly in terms of the level and type of detail. So first of all, the expanded resume at UT does not need to be 2 pages. And in fact, it could be 5 pages. I've seen more than 5 pages sometimes. So what they're really looking for, in addition to the basics of any activity that a student participated in, is, in addition, what were any opportunities that the student initiated something? And it could be something small. It could be that they set up the group chat for their team so that everyone could communicate during COVID. It could be that they invited other students to join a club. And in addition, anything the student is exploring, learning, even if there isn't a measured outcome of that, there's a lot of process that is also really relevant in an expanded resume. So the goal is for students to list every pertinent experience that they've had outside of sitting in a classroom, starting with the summer before 9th grade, all the way until they graduate, meaning that you kind of get to project forward a little bit about, I haven't done this activity yet, but I'm going to do it my senior year, and or I'm going to keep doing this my senior year, even though senior year, much of it won't have happened by the time you applied UT. You are allowed to project forward about that. The one area where you're not allowed to project forward is awards. So you can't say, I'm definitely going to get that award at the end of the year, but everything else you're allowed to project forward.
One thing I want to add here is that you can, let's say that you want to be an engineer, like this sample resume we're showing. If you've taken a bunch of engineering coursework, you can put classwork in there, and I encourage you to for UT, because some people may not go do, summer programs or get an internship. Maybe you have to work to help out or whatever. So don't be afraid to use your coursework and mix your coursework with extracurricular stuff. Same is true for business. Like a lot of the schools now have a pretty decent business curriculum, or even like psychology. So if there any place where you took some relevant curriculum to the major you're doing, go ahead and also put that in your resume.
Especially, and in those sections, especially if you did any research or completed a project where you got to choose what the project was about, those are really relevant fit to major activities within a classroom environment.
A couple of comments here. The first, and for students and parents, this may be helpful. A resume conjures up brevity and formatting. Think of this as an inventory of your activities that makes a case for your first choice major. Okay, involvement is wonderful, and we always say to kids, it's a great starting point. But many of the students who were admitted to competitive majors like computer science or engineering or business or nursing built on that involvement and took initiative. They were so interested in that major that they started things themselves, that they took the extra effort. And in some cases, they actually can point to the impact that they had given that. Good news, UT asked you to write about that impact. So the first comment on the major is really on the resume is really to understand it's an inventory of your activities and a case to be made. The second question that several people ask is, what about extracurriculars versus should I list my GPA and my test scores on that? Remember, they've seen your transcript. They know your test scores. So the human being that reads this is reading to understand you as a student, not to evaluate you academically. Allison, you've worked on these with so many students. Any other pointers to explain to folks in terms of not necessarily the formatting, but what makes the difference on a resume for a student applying to a competitive major?
So in addition to that fit to major, you know, like Bob said, they're reading this resume, this inventory of activities to get a sense of who you are, how you might engage, and how you might positively impact your fellow students. So anything, and a lot of the most wonderful things that the students that I have worked with on resumes, a lot of the most wonderful things that they've done aren't things that they really did deliberately. It's just kind of how they do things. And so we really help them think about like, well, okay, so you went to basketball practice and you did, you know, and you went to practice and you played games and you did all that. What would have been missing in that team if you didn't show up? What do they count on you for? What are things that you do as a member of that team that no one asks you to do? Oh, well, I always set up the group. This is an actual student I had a couple of years ago. I always set up the group chat in whatever club I join or group I'm in so that we can all stay connected. And that student didn't think that belonged on his resume because he wasn't doing it for any other reason than he just wanted people to be connected. And yet that can be such an impactful piece of information for an admissions officer trying to build a community of people that need connectors, right? And so a lot of it we call like, okay, so what else? What would be missing if that student wasn't there? What is something that you did that no one asked you to do, especially when it involves connecting with, communicating, or mentoring others? Those are a lot of things that students do that they kind of do just naturally, and maybe it's not that calculated, but that can be a really powerful piece to add to any activity if that's true for the student.
And I think what Allison is hitting on that's so important and is really important to UT after fit to major, leadership is really important. So what she's talking about is this wasn't just an athlete, he was being a leader on his team. And so those kinds of things are very, very important. Now, of course, we tell you this resume can be 3 pages, 4 pages. Make it an appropriate size for what the student has. So don't get just egregious and just like making one activity a whole page unless it was like something phenomenal. So, I mean, the majority of, you know, really competitive candidates we see have about 4 to 5 pages. I've seen some go to 7 or 8. And actually one of them I thought, oh, they really needed 7 or 8. So, but I wouldn't, it's not by the weight, okay? Like if you're just like putting things in there, but
non-traditional activities really do count. So it doesn't, and I think defining leadership is really important too, because leadership doesn't just mean I was the president of the student council. It could be I created that group chat. That's leadership. So it could be informal leadership, mentoring behind the scenes. It also could be unconventional, non-traditional activities like, you know, I was really bored during COVID and one of our computers broke, so I took it apart to see how it worked. That's cool. And I saw a question come through about, well, what if my student does an independent research activity? How do I prove that they did it? First of all, anytime you can link photos or something like that, or video, that's great. But otherwise, really, there's an honor system here that if a student is working on something that they're curious about and passionate about, the admissions officers take the resume at its word. And so they're not gonna, they don't need kind of proof of life of whatever that project was, but they can definitely tell in the describing of it how involved the student was, right? Because a student who did an independent project at home probably has lots to talk about why they did it and how they did it and what worked and what didn't. And so I really feel like, you know, the activities themselves tell the story. It could be things that you do with the youth group at your church. It could be things that you do independently. It could be common good activities, service work. We tell our students, if you're asking yourself the question, does this count? It does. Put it on there. Right? If it was something that you did that you enjoyed, that you learned from, or something that you did that you didn't enjoy, that you learned from, sometimes those are some of the best learning opportunities. Also, family responsibilities, things that you needed to do in order, especially during the pandemic, but outside of the pandemic too. A lot of students have really valid, really important family responsibilities that might keep them from being able to do as many outside of school extracurriculars. Those absolutely belong not only on this resume, but when we get to talking about essays, there's an essay, an optional essay that's especially directed at any extenuating circumstances that might have either impacted your grades or your level of involvement. And so that's a place for that story as well.
I hope everybody sees the importance of Fit to Major and resume. We're now going to turn our attention to essays. One last comment though on resume. Understand you're not applying for a graphic design major. How you format your resume, that's wonderful. We're certainly not going to tell you don't spend the time, but they're not going to evaluate you on that. They're going to evaluate you on the involvement you have, the initiative you took, and the impact you had. They're going to evaluate you as an applicant, particularly related to that first choice major.
And one last thing on that is that the currency in activities is the hours that you spend. So on a resume, as you'll see on this, if you can see it in the slide, it's like 36 hours a week for 1 week a year. So students, this is important because you don't want your resume full of 1 hour a week activities as you go on. You want to have things that you're spending a good bit of time on. So just understanding that hours are the currency in resumes is really, really important.
And that's a great point, Lisa, because a lot of students have been trained to think about hours in terms of service hours. Like the only thing that counts when you do, the only thing sometimes that schools count in service is the actual hours you spent doing the activity. Resume hours are not that. So anytime you spent, you're a lacrosse player and you traveled to a tournament and then you sat and waited while it was your turn to play. And then you sat and waited while it was your turn to play again. All of that time counts. And so it's kind of opposite of service hours. Anytime you spent practicing independently for an instrument that you also play in the band counts. Anytime you spent sending emails to fellow LLS fundraising team, like all of that counts. And so I think that is important to think about as well.